So I want to look at two things quickly for the sake of your discussion board. Um, One is the idea of a cult. What is a cult? There's been some good discussion around this, though not a ton, but some good. What's there has been fairly good. You're seeing the complexity of this issue, right? Technically speaking, a cult, as someone has noted, did the kind of the work of looking it up, is related to the word culture, cultus. It had to do with cultivation um, of crops. It has to do with civilization. So there's this sense in which you see civilization develop as you see kind of an agrarian culture develop, and much more complex religious systems and much more organized religious practices begin to come into play. Oftentimes, an established priestly class or some important requirements for kind of the ruling class, direct connections to the gods. Whereas almost every culture, every group of people has some sort of religious and spiritual beliefs, oftentimes mixed with some aspects of magic or superstition, which these are not all the same thing. You need to realize that, but they are often interconnected. Um, Almost everybody has that sense culturally of some kind of spiritual reality. That said, you see cults develop often, typically, amidst a sort of stability that comes with an agrarian, a cultivating culture, right? So this culture, these words are all related. So technically, broadly, cult is nothing negative. If you follow a religion in some sense, if you have a standard set of practices, a standard liturgy, an established sort of hierarchy, even a loose one, um, you're in some sense a cult practitioner, right? However, we have to deal with the realities of the way cultures and languages develop. And so, in our world, in our kind of American sense of reality, cult often carries a negative connotation. But that's when it gets really difficult, right? Because we want to say, well, here's some definitions that I've seen, right? Is when people are devoted to like one or two people, completely devoted in all aspects of their life. Well, let's see. Mother Teresa, right? Total devotion to Jesus Christ and um, Mary, the mother of Jesus. There's this deep life devotion. It affects everything she did with her life, everything she practiced, every decision she made. It was the core of her very being, her whole purpose in life. Do we think Mother Teresa when we kind of think this negative connotation of cult? So to get you almost to get really precise, and it's kind of like defining religion, right? We kind of know what we mean, but when we start trying to put words to it, it gets a little difficult. So I wanted you to recognize that we often use words to um, kind of critique people without offering a real critique, right? We label them. If we can label someone, we can dismiss them. If it's a cult, we can dismiss who they are and what they believe. We don't have to actually think about what they're saying. We don't have to contend with their ideas. We don't, because it's just a cult. And so that's often what happens with groups like Mormons, Jehovah's Witness, and really any church we don't like. Obviously, there are negative religious practices. Obviously, there are groups that are controlling, that are manipulative, that are dangerous. Um, we could say we want to reserve the word cult for a very controlling and negatively manipulative um, group, religious group that tends to um, uh, kind of suppress and oppress the followers within that group. Um, but we really do need to be precise and be thoughtful when we start to call things cults, because it does in our society have this rather negative meaning, in spite of the fact that the technical meaning is really nothing negative to it. It's just a human reality within cultures, right? So keep that in mind. The other thing that we need to look at is the spiritual but not religious. We'll come back to this more, um, probably as we go through discussions. But um, if you look at which religious groups came to the Americas, now early on, some of the earliest um, are really the outcasts of religious wars and religious competitions and religious struggles within the nations they came from. And the reality is, some of those first ones would have, and in some ways did choose to establish their governments based upon their religion. They wanted, it wasn't that they didn't want religious government, it's that they thought they were right, and so their government, their religion should control the government. So you have these kind of rules of how you have to be in compliance with the religion of the official religion of the state all over Europe. That's just been a reality of human history. That's the way religion was understood. Um, there are very few instances in history where that's not the case. Interestingly enough, when Christianity first moved into Northern and Western Europe, if you read what those kind of missionary monks were saying, they would go to kings and to princes and to nobles and try to convert them to Christianity. And when they did convert them, they would say, you can't force people to become Christians. You can get rid of bad practices. So if there are things going on, magic, we don't want that, or some kind of oppressive sacrificial system, we don't want that. You're a king, you can put a stop to those things, but you don't need to force people to follow religion. You need to show them the religion. And we have that early on in certain regions of Northern and Western Europe, as the first kind of missionaries moved in to there from Africa, the Middle East, Greece, and Rome. You get some of these earliest missionary bishops in the 500s, 600s, 400s even. Um, there's more of a sense of um, you ought to convince people through your actions, through through preaching. You shouldn't force a religion. But to a large degree, most cultures felt that the religion of the leader was to be the religion of the land. That's one of the ways you show loyalty to your government, to your people, throughout history and around the world. So there was that issue going on in England and Germany, where many of the early colonizers came um, to the Americas. Um, Sometimes, especially in the English colonies, it's that the laws of conformity state that you have to worship in certain ways. At certain churches, you can only preach certain things. And so these movements would flee um, for kind of religious freedom, but sometimes that religious freedom just meant they wanted the freedom to establish their religion. Um, that shifts slowly, though, because you saw groups, Anabaptists, Baptists, Mennonites, um, and others that came out of this rather radical movement of wanting to see the beginning of a separation of church and state. Interestingly, and I think I've mentioned this before, that desire for separation came from the religious side, not from the state side. The religious people didn't want government officials telling them how to worship, when to worship, why to worship, who to worship. They felt like that was not the place of government, and that was a radical idea. It was to protect the religion from the state, not to protect the state from religion, which is an interesting reality. We've kind of shifted that in our day and age. Um, so it's because, and it makes sense, right? The state has coercive power. The state has military power. The state has police. The religion doesn't. Um, the religion only has influence. It only has words and devotion. Um, and so these radical groups, radical meaning they were moving away from this connection between government and religion. They're some of the early kind of comers to the Americas, and we see those ideas influencing writings, uh, the Revolution, and we see um, this kind of negativity towards established religion. When you begin to see revival movements, the Great Awakenings, the first Great Awakening was closely tied to established churches. But when we see, the Cane Ridge movement and the groups like that, Finney and others, there's this certain established churches reject these movements, and so there's this kind of division created, um, where you're just being religious. Though Finney talks about good religion, being religious is a good thing in his writings, um, there's this kind of slow shift in the language to where we get into the 1990s and early 2000s, 100 years, 250 years later, and religion, the word religion, seems to take on this negative connotation where people who are Christians will say things like, I'm not religious, I have a relationship. And people who aren't necessarily of any kind of theological bent will say, well, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious, meaning they think there's a God and they want to pray, they may want to meditate, but we don't like these kind of established social structures that put confines on us. We have this sort of libertarian ideal, this American ideal of individualism. And one philosopher talks about the heretical imperative. An imperative is something that it's command, right? An imperative statement is a command statement. We have in our culture this tendency to follow what he calls the heretical imperative. You are obligated to come to your own understandings of your own spiritual beliefs and stand by those, and that's the ultimate in authenticity. And if you don't do that, you're just a fake and you're not a good person, because everybody wants to be authentic. And I'm not trying to make fun of that or anything. So that's the attitude of our culture. And so that attitude sort of rejects um, this religious establishment for the sake of the individual autonomy. And so Emerson writes about that, self-reliance, and other writings. These kind of quintessential American writers are very focused on the individual self and the individual authenticity. Think of Hemingway, think of others, that you have to be your own person. And most religious structures don't play into that very well, which is why we have a very negative sense of groups like the Jehovah's Witnesses or the Mormons that seem to maybe take a little bit more control than we're comfortable with. Strict church rules we don't tend to like. That's a cultural aspect related to who we are as Americans. So it's important to keep that in mind, and that's why I make the argument that for good or ill, um, in some sense, even sometimes people who claim to be of a specific religion in the sense of they're Christians or they're Muslims or they're Jewish or they're Buddhist, it's not about um, submission to this great tradition. It's very much about following the heretical imperative and coming to their own beliefs and being authentic to what they think and what they feel and what they want and what they understand is right, and their kind of personal relationship to divinity.